So this is a debate in clinical psychology and has been for a while. So there are some pros and cons to labeling something. So for one, if you have a name for a disorder, let's use like obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD for an example. If you label it and you give it, certain requirements and rules in this manual, it promotes consistency. So now everyone can look for the same exact symptoms and diagnose it similarly no matter where you are in the world. It also allows you to feel like you have other people who feel the same thing you do. There's a nice sense of knowing you're not alone in a particular thing. So having a label, for instance, I spoke about a disorder that I researched called misophonia at the very beginning of this semester. Um, Misophonia is this aversion to certain background chewing noises. I have heard countless stories of individuals who said, "I had no idea that had a name. I'm so glad that I'm discovering more people like this. I'm glad it's not just me. I'm glad I'm not alone." So there can be a pro to labeling a thing. And then lastly, more logistically, you can get insurance benefits. Maybe it pays your health insurance might pay for particular treatment if it's a diagnosable labeled condition versus if it's not. So being able to have a label helps you monetarily too. But there's also some cons to it. And some of the ones that you might have come up with here is there's a lot of stigma associated with mental health still. So having more and more labels that you can attach to yourself is just more and more reason that you might not get hired for a job, or you might not get looked at fairly for an interview, just different things. Unfortunately, in our society is still stigmatized. So maybe it's better to not have that official label attached to you. There's also this argument that you could call literally everything a disorder if you wanted to. There are 157. So at what point do you draw the line? And kind of related to that, medical professionals in particular say that the DSM is pretty bloated, meaning that there are so many disorders to keep track of that it's hard to even know if you were to go into a doctor's office. Chances are they might not remember every single stipulation of all 157 disorders. So a lot of medical professionals are of the mindset that we should reduce down the number of disorders that are labeled in the DSM just for ease. Let's say we're on board with labeling things. Let's say we're on the pro side of that column. Let's assess now whether this DSM is actually good at labeling things. And for that, we're going to pretend that the DSM is like a giant recipe book. I've chosen this one, the 1001 Best Baking Recipes of All Time. And we're going to kind of walk through some different problems with the DSM or pros of the DSM using this cookbook analogy. So one key thing about the DSM disorders is that it's all based on observable self-reported behavior. So diagnosing psychological disorders is a little different from diagnosing physical ailments. We can't really just like swab someone's brain and then get a positive or negative test result for depression. Or you can't just like stick someone in an MRI machine and do a brain scan and identify schizophrenia like you would a brain tumor. So we have to diagnose disorders in the DSM based purely off observable behaviors and self-reported symptoms. So you go into a doctor and you say, "I'm feeling this, this, and this." And our interpretation of those symptoms, what someone's experiencing, might be pretty subjective. What someone sees as problematic, another person might see as normal. And in similar ways to a cookbook where you're self-reporting and writing on your own recipes, no one's going in and like scientifically checking the calculations of chemical reaction amounts and things. Oh. So people are self-writing in recipes to a cookbook. As we mentioned in the previous slide, it promotes consistency in diagnosis. So in the same way that if you have a recipe in the cookbook for a chocolate cake, anywhere someone in the world could recreate that chocolate cake because they have all the ingredients, they have all the steps, they know what goes into that disorder. So it promotes consistency in that way. However, it is not perfect and it is constantly changing. It was meant to be a changing document because it wanted to change with the science. So as researchers are discovering more about particular conditions, it updates itself to reflect those conditions. That's why we're on DSM-5 right now. For example of this, homosexuality was considered a disorder in the third version of the DSM. Thankfully, that's been ousted by now, but you can see as things change in our society, this book changes too. So that's true of recipes as well, because you can constantly change up your recipe and it might not be perfect to your exact liking all the time. Okay, that stretch was a little bit, but bear with me, we're gonna keep going. So just to give you an example of what one of these checklists kind of looks like, here is the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. We are going to dive deeper into OCD at the end of this lecture. But for now, let's just take a look at the rules. So OCD requires that you have two different components. First component, you either need to have the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. And in order to have either of those things, you need both parts present. So if you pass this criteria, you also need to pass this criteria, that the obsessions or compulsions are time-consuming and cause you distress. There we have that, that kind of qualitative assessment that we talked about earlier. So there are multiple parts that have to be present. Just to kind of bring it back to our recipe analogy, there are certain things that your recipe needs to have. Not everything has to be present in the same way that you might have obsessions but not compulsions, and that would still count. So it's an or kind of situation. Let's say you are making chocolate chip cookies. You could add nuts, you could leave out the nuts, that's fine. That would still count as a chocolate chip cookie. But for the most part, general things are required. General symptoms need to be present. So for instance, if you're making a chocolate chip cookie and you don't have flour or you don't have chocolate chips, then you don't have a chocolate chip cookie. There are certain things that need to be there. I think recipes also, I think this analogy just helps illustrate the different things about why the DSM is not perfect and how it's constantly changing. So we're going to go through a couple more points. We talked before about how it's bloated with disorders. There are, 157 of them in the DSM. There are 1,001 baking recipes. Again, I don't think I could name 1,001 things that you could bake. So it kind of adds the question of, again, where is the line of what you classify as a new thing? If I add chocolate chips to a brownie recipe, is it a new brownie recipe? Or just a different version of the original one? So for instance, if you have OCD, like on the previous slide, but you also show depression symptoms, do you have a unique disorder that we should label, or just a different presentation of OCD? So those kinds of questions exist. Additionally, different symptoms, like for instance, depression, restlessness, tiredness, apply to multiple disorders. So in the same way that, you might add flour to majority of the things you're baking, if someone was like, I made a thing and I put flour in it, you wouldn't be able to easily pinpoint and diagnose what they made. So a lot of symptoms will apply to multiple conditions. They're not good enough to help you pinpoint what disorder that person has. And similarly, disorders present in different ways. Present means the way that it shows itself physically. So some disorders might present with slightly different symptoms. In the same way that we talked about like OCD having, depressive symptoms versus not, or maybe you have compulsions and obsessions or just one and it's still OCD. Maybe you have a fluffy, soft, chewy chocolate chip cookie, or you have a flatter, stiffer, crunchy chocolate chip cookie. They present different ways. They're physically different, but they're still both chocolate chip cookies. So that's something to consider. And then lastly, disorders are highly comorbid. Comorbid is another word that you might have heard before, but is a word that I think you should know. To be comorbid means that they appear at the same time. So it's kind of rare for someone to have just one mental health issue if they have a mental health struggle. So it's often things like depression and anxiety might go hand in hand, or PTSD and anxiety. There's so many combinations of things, but a lot of disorders appear at the same time. So pretend, for instance, you're hosting a party, or maybe you're at a wedding. It wouldn't be uncommon for you to have both cookies and cupcakes at the same time at the same party. So it's hard to kind of distinguish what symptoms and traits are belonging to which of those disorders.